Alright, so like I was saying before, when we do these like multiple videos all throughout the month for September and October, I plan them like, a couple of months in advance or so, what I was going to do here. But after that, somebody, I think it was our good fellow Tim, who gives us a lot of suggestions, had mentioned The Devil's Backbone and Chronos, which I'm really glad that while I did have this one planned from the get-go, I'm really glad that Chronos got brought up because Chronos might be my favorite Del Toro. So I do absolutely want to talk about it at some point. But in the meantime, I figured we'd go with the Orphanage set ones, or one that's actually Del Toro, and then one that Del Toro played a massive part in help bringing to life. Because it is, to my understanding, it was, we basically have Mimic to thank for him kind of returning to his roots, where he had, success with Chronos and stuff like that, and then Mimic was the whole idea of, getting a foreign director to go Hollywood, but Mimic ended up not doing very well, and usually when that would be, like, the sort of death of a director, like, they do something great in their home country and then try to come to Hollywood and then just almost be kind of shamed out. Del Toro just went right back to where he was, basically. And made what is still one of his best movies, and that's saying something. With this, and then later on would sort of use that clout to get The Orphanage made for J.A. Bayona. So I think we'll just kind of go into these one at a time, because they not only do they have like similar settings, and they both have Del Toro's name on them in one way or another, but the way they approach the horror genre feels very similar to me as well, in this really great way that we don't see enough of. So I'm going to go ahead and start with The Devil's Backbone since it came first, where we have our, I think we're like right around the Spanish Civil War, which would be like the mid to late 30s. And like I was saying, we have this orphanage setting where we have this, it's almost like this coldness about it, where it's like the orphanage basically has like the coldness of a hospital, basically. And it can almost feel really like dehumanizing the way they have like the beds numbered and stuff like that. It's only when the kids are talking amongst themselves that we realize the significance of a particular bed, the bed that our lead character Carlos has been given, due to it being initially belonging to Santi, the kid that has disappeared, that you may or may not be able to see on the cover. This very haunting, eerie image that's also on the spine. So when it's on the shelf itself, it is just constantly haunting. But that's the thing, though, is talking about a haunting image like this child that is a ghost now. I feel like there's something here where it might seem silly it might seem silly by comparison to these movies and how serious they are, but I always come back to the show Are You Afraid of the Dark, that I'm assuming most people my age grew up on in some way. And I've always credited Are You Afraid of the Dark for kind of being this introduction to people who were my age at the time about the idea that obviously there's horror stories and campfire stories about ghosts and stuff like that, but I feel like that show especially is what really opened me up to the idea of ghosts also being tragic figures, and this whole idea of, needing to finish something or needing to seek out some sort of, correcting of what happened in order for them to rest completely. And because that's what a lot of those episodes ended up being. And so this whole idea that this image of something could be like totally terrifying, but when you know the story, it kind of becomes more of a tragic image than anything else. And I feel like that's definitely something that both of these movies deal with. Is there's stuff here that's definitely creepy and definitely terrifying, but when you know the full story, it's really just incredibly sad and heartbreaking at the end of the day. But that horror quality never quite fades. Like, there's always going to be a creepy level to it regardless. But rather than it being, like, relentlessly scary, there's sort of a balance there with these really extreme emotions between, horror and sadness. But they really come together in this beautiful way. And so following this story, It is, like, talking about our lead character in general, with Carlos in The Devil's Backbone, it does feel like, we're seeing a kid that's, like, out of his element, and there's a whole lot of strange things going on here. There was the whole idea of the bomb dropping out of the sky that didn't detonate. So it's just planted in the ground in the middle of this. And there's some theories about that. Really, the way I've always taken the bomb is this, and there's there could be definitive answers, but there's also all the theory answers. But the thing that I've always kind of taken away from the bomb was the idea of just kind of building tension in general, and this whole idea of the story that's lurking underneath this concept, is this sort of ticking time bomb, and there's that anticipation of waiting for it to go off in some way. And that's the thing, is when you just see like a bomb, especially when it's just been dropped, the first thing you're going to feel is anticipation and suspense. So I feel like that really is very tone setting, especially when it's just constantly present. And it's this thing that we just kind of keep coming back to. Like it's sort of like it's giving off the vibe that there's something here that needs to have attention drawn to it. And of course that being exactly how, like in regards to Santi's disappearance and what exactly this unfinished business is that he has. But while there's like parallel stories going on here, there's quite a bit happening in this movie, but it's all incredibly cohesive throughout in this really impressive way. Because a lot of it is like, just seeing things in general through the eyes of this child, Carlos, who has this whole sort of innocence around him, especially given what's going on around him, even though he doesn't know that yet. And we just kind of discover it through his eyes. Like everything he discovers, we're sort of discovering at the same time with him. And so we have stuff where like he surprises us by the way he's like approached by a bully, and the bully dares him to do something. He just sort of immediately turns it around on him, in this really great way. But there's also the stuff where we get to see stuff through childhood fears, because it's like, there's the caretaker, who's like the real villain of this movie, who's an actual living adult, who is an absolute threat. And then we have the ghost, Santi, this very haunting, scary image just sort of lurking around, that we see faintly and gradually, like we see just enough of a hint of face in like a window or something, and already it's terrifying. It's like the Salem's Lot scene that will never leave my mind. But on top of all that, on top of all of the genuinely scary things we have here, we also have this dare scene where they have to sneak out and get water. And there's the whole childhood fear of being caught doing something you're not supposed to be doing. And it's like that in itself, to be able to put in all these different sort of levels of fear that a child would experience, like kind of all at once too. Because not only is it just like the fear of being caught, but you're like in this strange place and you're going into all these really, really dark rooms that all have this creepy vibe to them. Even if we didn't know there was a child's ghost lurking around here, these places would still just be sort of naturally eerie, because Del Toro does atmosphere like nobody else. This movie has atmosphere for days, and like everything almost feels like you're kind of stepping into this sort of nightmarish place. And even when there's a little relief, like when we have daytime scenes, we still might see the window of a dark room that may or may not have a face lurking in it. And the way he really captures those, like those really deep-seated fears that we all are just basically born with, and kind of putting them all in this movie all at once, and giving this whole feel of, in a sense, just a child being in a new place, and that strangeness and the fear that would eventually come from that. It all feels very, like, the idea of establishing a fear that's so real and relatable, and then putting, like, ghosts in the movie and stuff like that, is going to give it a feel that a lot of horror movies don't have, or can't quite reach. And so obviously a lot of these creepy setups are going to be very low-key. We have, like, the shadow behind the curtain that isn't there when you pull it away. No big music score or anything like that. No, sound effects screaming in your face. We're just sort of watching it happen, like I said, through Carlos's eyes. And seeing the footprints and stuff like that, and just the ambient sound in general is the only thing that's present, which can just be so eerie in itself, even more eerie than a score could be. Um, because ambient sound like actually puts you there when a score, well, scores can be great, are also essentially telling you what to feel. Like I said, with these fears being so relatable and real, you don't need to be told what to feel. It's gonna be there. It's set up well enough. Um, but talking about low key stuff, there are gonna be big scares as well. They're gonna be few and far between, but that just means they're gonna be more effective when they get there. So stuff like you can talk about how like oh it's nice there's no score and there's no loud noise and things popping out or anything like that. Um, but when we do get to the scene where like the eye appears in the keyhole, which is a much more traditional scare, that makes it all the more terrifying that we've had just like these small moments and these low key scares and creepy moments throughout. That when the big ones do come sparingly, they're gonna hit in a really big way and in a really effective way, and to the point that it doesn't even feel cheap. It feels earned by that point. Um, and it's the kind of thing where it's like it's almost like this sort of release where you kind of feel like something's going. That anticipation we talked about with the bomb, where you get the sense that like a big scare is coming, but it takes so long to get there, that when it finally does, it feels bigger than it ever would have if it had just happened right away. But that's the thing is it's not it doesn't just feel like the low key scares and the creepy factor is building to that. Like they're working on their own, and then it's only after a big scare happens you realize, oh, we were building to that, which is great. It's the stuff you don't realize until like it's in retrospect. Um, and then when we finally do see Santi like kind of in close up, where he's like I said, he's very gradually revealed throughout, and we see like his form or like just like half of his face or something. The creepiest stuff in the movie for sure. And then when we do see him, and there's that effect of his blood flowing upwards, where like you can tell he's in water. Um, it's stuff like that where like you can see the story kind of unraveling. That is if you can like look at the screen long enough without being just completely scared shitless by it, which is great. But that's the thing though, is the idea of all these parallel stories going on to the ghost story. And you would think there'd be some sort of clashing of tones here or something, but all the stories in this are so engrossing, whether it be just following Carlos in general and seeing childhood fears through his eyes, or the idea that there's a ghost lurking around, or the whole thing with the caretaker and the gold, and all the people, and him like basically working his way around trying to find out where it is, having like affairs and shit, with these characters that feel very real. Like the Doctor especially feels like a very tragic character throughout this. And even his wife, who does have the affair, but there's still just something so tragic lurking around most of these characters. Like I said, tragedy is something that kind of follows this movie around, and it's not just Santi's story, though it is a big part of it. Like I said, the way we learn as Carlos learns about what's going on here, and the way this unravels, is so masterfully done. Like just from us, like. Yeah, it's, creating the creep factor and the atmosphere and the scares and stuff like that. But just as far as unraveling a story, too, he's just really done something incredibly special with this movie. And how we were talking about, like, every newly discovered place in here basically feels like a tomb. Like, it has that sort of creepy factor. And that's spawned some theories about the bomb. Like, there's the whole idea that, the bomb actually went off and this is just a whole bunch of people in purgatory. I don't always buy into, like, the purgatory theory. Just, like, in general, it's a theory you hear a lot. Everybody wants everything to be the Jacob's Ladder thing. And I don't typically buy into that. We'll go much more into theories with the Orphanage, which I can... grasp onto and get into. But here, Devil's Backbone, I kind of take pretty much at surface, at face value. So, watching it from like a storytelling standpoint, where all these stories manage to coexist, and then ultimately naturally come together to this satisfying conclusion. And it is one of those cases, we were just talking about this the other day, about whether predictability is a bad thing or not. And while it certainly can be, there are also stories where it's like, it just kind of feels inevitable how this movie ends and where we get to that point when the caretaker's under the water and then Santi is there, and it's like, it's all, and we talked about this with those Are You Afraid of the Dark episodes as well, where it was a ghost with unfinished business, and it's like, these stories, once they set themselves up, we already know their inevitable conclusions, and we know what's going to help these ghosts rest. So in a sense, they become predictable, but it's that whole idea of if it reaches a satisfying conclusion and it's what the audience wants. Like, it may be predictable that we see the caretaker underwater and then Santi appears and pulls him under, but it's like, when that's what the audience wants to see and that's what they're hoping happens, that's a particular case where predictability would be a good thing and a satisfying thing, rather than the infuriating thing that it can be sometimes if the movie's bad enough. But like I said, sometimes they're just conclusions that we want and we're just waiting for and hoping for. And when they do come, they are incredibly satisfying. So, like I said, I definitely think, and I do really like, Pan's Labyrinth and The Shape of Water and stuff like that. When I was talking about Kronos being my favorite Del Toro, I feel like this is right behind it. As far as Del Toro's best, and I know it kind of sounds bad to say he peaked early or something, but I don't think that's the case. He's obviously a consistently great director and is constantly opening up these worlds of imagination, and not even just movies he directed, obviously movies that he helps bring to life, like The Orphanage as well. He's just a gift to the movie world in general, and the TV world, if you want to throw It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia in as well, but. Yeah, and I've talked about how much I love Pacific Rim as well, but there's just something he really captured here, where this movie feels like a classic ghost story, but it also feels so unique in its way as well, in the way it tells its story, and like I said, the parallel stories and how they all sort of come together, but they're all engrossing in their own right. They all could be their own movie, and they'd all be just as fascinating, and that they come together in such a satisfying way. Is just I really, really love this movie a lot. So to go on to The Orphanage, where once again we're also dealing in that territory where a lot of the horror is very, very downplayed. Probably you could say significantly more downplayed than even The Devil's Backbone, where we have our lead character Laura, who was once at an orphanage and then was ultimately adopted and then comes back to the orphanage in hopes of opening it up to like disabled kids and all that, and helping in this really big way. And she also has her son, her adopted son, and right away, before we really go into it, there's a whole setup here where we were talking about the way that we set up Carlos's innocence and seeing childhood fears through his eyes. Another prominent childhood fear that never leaves us is the fear of the inevitability of death. And the idea that we're setting up that her child here is sick and dying, and so he has this constant fear and fixation on death. And like that right away feels like it's setting up this sort of layer of fear, once again, coming from a very real place, which when that's the start of it and the foundation of the fear that's going to eventually come out of this movie, that's a really good start, like grounding it in that sort of reality of a fear that we know all too well. And then carrying that through what the rest of the events of the movie is going to be and the way it plays out. And just these little moments, like even just a line every now and then, when they're talking about like Peter Pan and, growing up and not growing up. And when he's talking about his new imaginary friends, and she says, they're talking about Peter Pan, and she's like, are they the same way? Like, are they going to grow up? And his response is just, they can't. And then just immediately, like I said, just a couple of words can set such a creepy tone with what's going on here. And then as it goes on, and we meet certain characters like the social worker, it gives me serious Mrs. Baylock vibes. And it sets itself up like kind of a traditional horror movie in that sense. And then, the child disappears, and then, months go by. And then it kind of starts to become something else. Well, I mean, it does have a traditional horror story at its core. Like I said, it's all in the execution. And what we're doing here is pretty much, you could say, just as special as what Del Toro is doing in something like The Devil's Backbone. And it's one of those cases where I could see this being dismissed by like a mass audience as one of those nothing happens movies. that sort of more artistic movies kind of get, you know, lumped into. If it's all about sort of anticipation. But the thing about it is that while this movie was even praised for how, like, you know, long its build up is, but I feel like the suspense is so potent that it feels like there's always something happening. Like, you always, throughout the whole movie, have that feeling. And like I said, I think the dread that comes from setting up the whole fear of death thing in general is such an effective start and already plants that in you, that is something that just kind of sticks throughout the movie as, you know, this sort of mystery starts to reveal itself. Once again, a mystery we see pretty much entirely through the eyes of our lead character, who's just an adult now. But we do have some stuff in here, like gore-wise. Like, we have the fingernail, which is just fuck you for that. Like, anything fingernail related, you can go fuck yourself. But there's also the stuff like when the social worker gets hit by the ambulance, and like the whole jaw thing is really fucked up and almost like nightmarish. And then the whole story of the social worker's child, the deformed kid that wore the bag that Laura's child seems to have been seeing around. And when we get that whole backstory, and we see his face, and it's one of those things, like we were talking about with when we see Santi in The Devil's Backbone, where it's like, it is terrifying. Like, it is very, very creepy, and it is an image that will plant itself in your brain and haunt you for a very, very long time. But the difference is that there's just something so incredibly tragic here, and this is something that a child, both of these children, had no control over, becoming these things that could be seen as monsters. And the tragic thing about the kid in the orphanage is that it was when he was alive. And it's like Santi didn't become creepy until, you know, after death, when he was a ghost. But still, with both of them, it's the tragedy of it that really elevates that. And like I said, when it's already... The way tragedy makes you feel vulnerable anyway, since you're in this vulnerable state now, the creepiness is going to hit you harder too. Which is a really skillful way to do this kind of thing. Now, the idea, and talking about the theories that come into this, the idea of the fact that we're seeing all of this through Laura, a lot of theories that come into play about how much of this movie is real and how much of it, you know, is her, you know, having visions or it just kind of being in her head. It's like, did she even leave the orphanage when she was a kid? All that stuff. And it's some of them I feel like maybe go a bit overboard. It's something that I feel like is a little too... Like, I don't want to, you know, take away from anybody's interpretation of it, especially with the Orphanage is just abstract enough that I feel like it's one of those movies... I guess you could say this about any movie. There's not really a wrong answer, because that's the whole thing about movies being art, is people can just, you know, take from them what they will. But as far as, like, the movie feeling believable in how it portrays certain things, you could absolutely take it at face value, and it works perfectly. But it is... And I would say, as simple as it sounds, I probably also more or less take it at face value, but I'm interested in going down these paths and imagining the whole idea of, like... Because we only, as far as I remember, we only see, like, the visions of the children, like, when we actually see them, like, when when the ghosts are physically present, if that's what you want to call them, it's always through Laura's perspective. So it already kind of sets up this idea of, if she's the only one seeing it, is that the whole thing? And then this brings in the whole account of the existence of her child to begin with, or if, like, her missing child is just the trauma from everyone around her at the orphanage, you know, disappearing. There's a lot of ways you can take that, and it's like the way we only see the supernatural from a certain angle is... Yes, like, even when we get stuff that's so incredibly well done, where it's, where the knock on the wall scene, when the way the camera keeps moving back and forth, and it's like, I don't know of a scene in a horror movie. There's very few scenes in any movie that I feel are as suspenseful as the knock on the wall scene, and the way the camera moves. And it's just, I remember that's one of those times where the first time you see that scene is a time you will never forget. Like, you will never forget the first time you saw that scene. But yeah, the whole idea of, let's say we are going with the theory that this could be kind of in her head and she's the only one seeing the supernatural stuff, it gives us this feeling of being basically trapped in it, the way that she is, which is a very terrifying feeling. Um, and just the whole idea of where we're talking about her child and it potentially being like maybe just trauma from the disappearances at the orphanage. The fact that he's not her biological child feels like it plays into that an awful lot. Because if it was a child she actually had, it would be like, well, you can't really imagine that. So it feels like it is planting these little seeds of the possibility of there's something significantly more psychological going on here than the face value might give you, or might seem like it's going. Um, and there's probably stuff that could potentially be negated, especially with the involvement of her husband. But like that just seems like it's really opening up the can of worms of how deceptive her mind might be. And that in itself, like the whole idea of just feeling sort of, even, whether it's real or not, this whole idea of feeling trapped with this whole concept, it can be terrifying in itself. But as we talked about with the Devil's Backbone, there is going to be an emotional factor to this as well. And when we learn the story of the orphans and stuff like that, this movie goes from terrifying and suspenseful to maybe one of the most heartbreaking stories in a horror movie. And how they're able to take this ending when she like reunites with them after her suicide, and it's like that we were talking about the balancing of tragedy and horror throughout this, where it's like whether it's the story of Santi or the kid here, the social worker's kid, but this ending eventually gets us to a point. Obviously, I said Devil's Backbone takes us to a satisfying conclusion, where Santi can finally rest after the killing of the caretaker. But what the orphanage brings us to, ultimately at the end of the day, is balancing tragic and profoundly heartwarming. Like the scene where she reunites with all the orphans, and she's basically there to care for them now in this sort of other afterlife sort of world. And that end at the end, it might seem cheesy, but that last shot of her husband smiling in the cemetery is something that I really love too. And like I said, the way it sort of takes us out of the bleakness. Like I said, it's just full of tragedy, but to leave us like with this sort of happy feeling and this content feeling after all of that feels really satisfying. Also, where you talk about the release of a horror movie and like all the tension that it builds up, and that's like all the Orphanage is that tension and that build up, that undetonated bomb on the Devil's Backbone. And usually the release is a big scare, like the eye in the keyhole in the Devil's Backbone. And it feels like the big payoff in the Orphanage is the emotional payoff, where we're actually sort of bittersweetly happy at the end, but while also just incredibly, incredibly sad. And it's wild that a movie like that could just be kind of dismissed into the horror genre. When if people that just completely dismiss horror movies, this is the kind of stuff they sometimes miss out on. It's like we were talking about before, horror is this really beautiful genre that has so many different aspects to it and so many different portrayals of what horror is. And then the stories you can tell with that stuff. And you can get like really, really beautiful stuff like this. As far as like a preference, I feel like the emotional payoff in The Orphanage goes a very long way, and it's something that like just has always stuck with me for so long. But like if I had to like say if there's a movie I prefer, and it might be easy to say The Devil's Backbone because The Devil's Backbone kind of constantly has stories going on, and The Orphanage is more about that just building tension. But like just the way the stories unravel in The Devil's Backbone to me is just so irresistible, and I just love the way they come together and the way they play out. So The Devil's Backbone is the movie I'm probably more likely to revisit. But The Orphanage is this really beautiful story and its portrayal of horror and terror and the creep factor building and suspense is like is matched by very, very few. So there's definitely something to admire here in both. But like I said, I probably prefer The Devil's Backbone. Even I know it feels weird to say I prefer The Devil's Backbone when The Orphanage definitely has a much is kind of a more powerful experience at the end of it. But I guess that's my loving, stories and story-driven stuff coming out. But both are obviously really accomplished what they set out to do in the kind of their own ways, despite the many similarities they have. So yeah. So I guess I can just leave this at this. So we will continue. I'm going to talk about the Scenes from a Marriage miniseries, the new one, as well as new releases and other stuff, other verses and horror stuff until we get to the end of the month, and then we will go from there. So whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.